Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 42, and in today's episode, we are covering the 10th book in the Young Jack Sparrow series, which is called Sins of the Father. This is my personal favorite in this entire series, and I cannot wait to get into it. Now, if you haven't read the previous book, Dance of the Hours, or listened to the episode I did covering it, I highly recommend you do so, because at the end of that book, there is a crazy reveal that I think you should find out there first before I say it in a few seconds. I'll give you a second to pause. Good? Okay. So, Dance of the Hours ended with the reveal that Edward Teague, the Keeper of the Code, is nearby on his ship, the Misty Lady, and he's being pursued by a whole fleet of Royal Navy ships. And that's not all. The even crazier reveal is that Fitzwilliam P. Dalton III, Jack's last remaining crewmate, who has been sailing with him for the past year now, and has been in every single one of these books since the beginning, has betrayed Jack. We found out that Fitzy was a spy for the Royal Navy the entire time, and he has been trying to help the Navy find and capture Captain Teague. So obviously this has really hit Jack pretty hard, and this book is going to get pretty crazy, so I hope you're all ready for it. So without further ado, let's dive right into Book 10 of the Young Jack Sparrow series, Sins of the Father. So the book begins with a little backstory on Jack's early life before this series began, along with a recap of some of the things that happened over the course of these books. So we're going to start right here. Let's dive right into the book. So the book opens up with this. Imagine for a moment that you are a runaway, fleeing from a way of life you're not sure you want, but fear you might be destined for. Your household is full of pirates who terrorize the seven seas, and each other. Family reunions, holiday celebrations, and strolls in the park inevitably crumble into massive brawls where the kids are suddenly beating up their uncle, Captain Ace Brannigan. Then, second auntie Quick Draw McFleming tosses yet another tankard at poor old Grandmama, who even at 82 is not so defenseless, what with the half-dozen daggers she keeps tucked away in her girdle. While all this is going on, the man who's been raising you, who may or may not be your father, is plotting some way to overthrow the current patriarch and secure the family inheritance of plundered treasure for himself. You might, in circumstances like these, decide that you need some time away, to leave the madness behind for a while and set aside a few days, or weeks, or perhaps even years, to think things through. So to get things started, one night, after the family has had a particularly rough day and everyone's knocked out, either from exhaustion or from having been throttled over the head with a blunt object, you strike a match and sneak by candlelight into the study. It's a room housing a three-legged chair, a handful of dusty old books with some pages missing, and dozens upon dozens of half-empty rum bottles. Apart from the thick cover of cobwebs and an occasional tarantula, the only other item in the room is a huge leather-bound book, the size of a tombstone, marked Pirata Codex. You know that this book is important to your family, and in fact, to all pirates. It is the law they live by, and you are going to use it to your advantage. You turn to a section that is all about freedom and the need for a pirate to make decisions for himself. You decide that this clearly gives you justification to leave this maddening household with these intolerable people you call your family. With a wry smile, you close the heavy cover. Then you make your way over to the far end of the room, pry the nails out of the window, which, like the others in the house, has been boarded up for as long as you have lived there, and suddenly you are free. It's as easy as that. Or is it? For the young man called Jack Sparrow, nothing about this scenario is hypothetical. As unbelievable as it may be, this is his life story, or at least part of it. Shortly after Jack snuck away, he realized that his newfound freedom had come with a heavy price. Maybe the man who might be Dad hadn't always supported him in his hobbies. He had, for example, a particularly difficult time understanding Jack's interest in cosmetics, but he had been there to knock Rusty Knickers over the head just before the pirate nearly severed Jack's hand with his crusty old sword when Jack was 6, and when Captain Lucille Graven attempted to sell Jack into servitude at the age of 12. The man who might be Dad was there again, ready to save Jack's hide. But now, Jack was suddenly going about everything on his own, and though he didn't want to admit it, part of him was not sure he was ready for that kind of freedom. He did know that he did not want to be like the rest of his family. He didn't want to be a pirate. He did, however, want to be a captain, just like the man who might be Dad, whose name was Teague. Whenever he was aboard Teague's ship, Jack thought to himself, now how hard can this be? You just assemble any group of seafaring dolts, apparently half of which can be drunk at any given time, hop on a ship, give yourself the proper air of authority that makes said dolts adhere to your whims as you bark orders, and voila! So one of the first things Jack did upon securing his freedom was find a boat. It was called the Barnacle, and it was a rickety old vessel that was barely seaworthy. Then he assembled a crew, but since that time things had changed. Though he still had his boat, his crew had abandoned him. All of his crew, that is, with the exception of one crew member, Fitzwilliam P. Dalton III. From the outset, Jack did not like Fitzwilliam, and he certainly hadn't wanted him to join his crew. But the boy, who claimed to have been a runaway aristocrat, put Jack in a very compromising position. Fitzwilliam had threatened to turn Jack in for the theft of the Barnacle if he did not allow Fitzwilliam to come aboard. When Jack still refused, Fitzwilliam challenged him to a duel. Jack hadn't been trained in swordsmanship the way Fitzwilliam had. Though Jack put up a valiant fight, Fitzwilliam overcame him, and the rest, as they say, is history. For about a year now, the two had been sailing together. Jack had to admit that there was some value in having Fitzwilliam on board. He was an excellent swordsman, and whenever Jack's ragged crew needed to blend in with proper society, Fitzwilliam was a helpful cover. Still, Jack and Fitzwilliam were often bickering and never quite saw eye to eye on matters of navigating the Barnacle, or responding to threats from pirates, sea creatures, and cursed captains. In truth, not that he would have dared admit it, something deep inside Jack actually enjoyed the bitter back and forth. He loved antagonizing Fitzwilliam, and there was nothing Jack savored more than working the aristocrat into a apoplectic fit of rage. But it always seemed that that was where their rivalry ended. Until now. Because now, Jack found himself on the deck of the Barnacle, holding up his hands, with Fitzwilliam's sword pointed at his chest. Even Jack, who prided himself on having a type of sixth sense, had not seen this coming. "You were a fool to trust me," Fitzwilliam said. He wore a half-insane grin. "Whoever said I trusted you, mate? I trust no one," Jack said sincerely. "Why else would you have kept me aboard your vessel, Captain?" "Because I had a need, and you were able to fill it, savvy?" Jack replied curtly. The aristocrat sneered. "You make me ill at ease," he snarled. "Then I am doing a right fine job," Jack said, inching away from Fitzwilliam. Jack had been so taken aback by this turn of events that he had almost forgotten that Fitzwilliam was only one of the problems plaguing him at this very moment. Jack turned and looked out to sea, and what seemed to be the entire Royal Navy, along with some East India Trading Company ships, were fast approaching the Barnacle. Perhaps worse than this was the vessel the fleet was pursuing. It was a pirate ship, and it flew a Jolly Roger that Jack was all too familiar with. He regarded each of these three threats, which formed a deadly triangle around him. Before him was an aristocrat who Jack hadn't necessarily trusted, but who he also never suspected of being capable of this kind of treachery. And yet, here he was, holding Jack at bay, while a fleet of Navy ships brought up the rear. And the Navy ships were, of course, another problem to consider. Fitzwilliam had alluded to the fact that he was working with them, that their goal was to use Jack to lead them to Teague. This would not make Teague happy. Which led Jack to a problem number 3. That ship with the familiar Jolly Roger trying to flee the Navy belonged to the pirate that might be Jack's dad. And father or not, Teague was not very pretty when he was angry. Jack sighed in frustration. These 3 bitter ingredients were surely a recipe for disaster. So let's recap this real quick. So first, at the beginning of the chapter, we learn a bit about Jack's past before the series began. And we also learn about some of his relatives, which include Captain Ace Brannigan, Quick Draw McFleming, and Grandmama. And we also learn about how Teague had saved Jack multiple times as a kid, once from Rusty Knickers, who was ready to behead Jack, and also from Lucille Graven, who attempted to sell Jack into slavery when he was 12. And as I stated in the last episode, the relationship between Jack Sparrow and Edward Teague is pretty ambiguous. In this chapter specifically, Teague is continuously referred to as the man who might be dad. Obviously, from watching the movies, you get the notion that Teague is indeed Jack's dad, and that's the end of it. But from this book, and also in The Price of Freedom when we get to that later, we are going to realize that their relationship is a bit more complicated than we thought. Teague is the man who raised him, that we know for sure. But if Teague really is Jack's biological father, well, that is a topic for another time. But anyway, let's get back to the present and continue on with Jack and Fitzwilliam. So the two of them are still on the deck of the Barnacle as the Navy and the East India Trading Company approaches, and obviously this is some juicy stuff, so we're going to go right back into the book. So chapter 2 begins, and Jack says, "Look here," Jack said to Fitzwilliam when he had fully digested the various terrible scenarios before him. "You can't mutiny. Besides, not being very democratic, it would make you rather stupid. You dare saddle me with that epithet? You, who allowed me to come aboard your ship and trail you until you led me to the notorious Captain Teague? Please, Jack, let us be reasonable and fair. You are the stupid one among us," Fitzwilliam spat back. "Well, stupid's relative, ain't it, Fitzy? See, here you are thinking I am the one lacking smarts. Well, I would say that is you who voluntarily picked a fight with Teague over there. Trust me, I've been there. You're not going to win." "Perhaps you forget that I have brought reinforcements," Fitzwilliam said smugly, motioning to the Royal Navy ships that were still on course for the Barnacle. "Teague's evaded them before," Jack said, stretching and yawning. "This will just be further practice for him. See, in the end, you're helping him out. But here we are digressing when we should be continuing our argument or some such. So, getting back to the subject." "Yes," Fitzwilliam said, "getting back to the subject. Prepare to meet your fate." Fitzwilliam quickly drew his shiny sword. "Actually, Fitzy, the subject at hand was not swordplay, but stupidity, and you are proving your own strength in that department by forgetting that it was the topic under discussion." Jack now drew his old rusty sword with the golden tip. "And if you remember, though you probably don't, as a lame brain like you could barely seem to remember the Florida coast is west of the Antilles, what I was referring to as stupid was your plot to mutiny. And just because you didn't ask, and because there is nothing I love more than boring people, quite especially you, with details, I posit that is a stupid idea because it takes a crew to mutiny. A crew, mate. Not one well-dressed, stuffy aristocrat who doesn't even have enough mental agility to figure out how to use contractions when he's speaking." Fitzwilliam's face went red. "Ah, were you an actual captain aboard an actual ship, I might agree with you. However, you're nothing other than a small, insignificant boy aboard a ship that's always 2 minutes away from taking on water and capsizing." Jack sneered at Fitzwilliam, then looked around, casually glancing at the Barnacle and the ragged state it was in, before resigning to these facts and shrugging in agreement. "Now, Captain," Fitzwilliam went on, pointing his sword at Jack's belly, "please vacate this ship. It is the property of the East India Trading Company." "Over my dead body," Jack said casually, examining the dirt beneath his fingernails. "If that is what you wish," Fitzwilliam said, crashing his sword down toward Jack's head. Jack lifted his own sword, defending himself against a heavy blow. The telltale clank of metal against metal heralded the beginning of their fight. The clanging rang out as they continued to spar, providing a musical score for their deadly dance. "Recognize these here moves of mine, Fitzy?" Jack asked. Fitzwilliam just snarled. "Well, you should. Who do you think I learned them from?" Jack said as he nimbly jumped onto the Barnacle's railing and moved across it in a crab-like fashion as the boys continued to spar. Jack's sword-fighting abilities were, in fact, very similar to Fitzwilliam's. Jack had been watching the other boy and examining his moves for the past year, and he had learned much. One thing Jack Sparrow knew was that in order to get the upper hand, one had to acknowledge his own deficits and work hard, however subtly, to overcome them. Jack had never been a very good sword fighter. Fitzwilliam, on the other hand, though Jack hated to admit it, was an expert. So Jack had watched and learned, and though even he himself might not have known it, Jack was becoming an expert too. "Jackie!" a voice called out behind Jack. "Where on earth did you learn to fight like that? You were always so, well, frankly, awful." Jack spun around, turning his eyes from his opponent and toward the man's voice that boomed behind him, all the while still successfully deflecting Fitzwilliam's attack. "Oh, it's you," Jack said flatly. Teague's ship had caught up with the Barnacle. The pirate was standing at the broadside, smiling down at Jack. He was a tall man with ragged curly hair and a bandana similar to Jack's tied around his head. His long red overcoat looked like a cape, and he wore a sword on each of his hips. Every one of his fingers was adorned with a ring. Jack hated Teague's casual demeanor. He had such a disgusting air of confidence. It looked like the entire Royal Navy was on Teague's tail, and yet here he stood, looking down at Jack battling away with an insolence that indicated absolutely no worry whatsoever. Teague's mannerisms just confirmed what Jack already knew. Teague wasn't worried in the least. Davy Jones, the cursed captain who sailed the ghost ship with the Flying Dutchman and was feared all over the seven seas, could have emerged in front of them right now, complicating this already impossible situation further, and Teague would not bat an eye. It was stomach-turning. "You think you might want to help me out here?" Jack asked, still deflecting Fitzwilliam's blows. Fitzwilliam seemed to be so focused on defeating his opponent that the aristocrat didn't even acknowledge the appearance of Teague, or the banter between him and Jack. Jack thought that Fitzwilliam's silence spoke volumes about how intent he was on killing Jack. The snotty aristocrat usually couldn't keep his mouth shut. "You didn't seem to want any help when you decided to run out on us, Jackie," Teague responded. "I don't need this right now," Jack said. "Dear old grandmama nearly died of grief when you left," Teague said. "Dear old grandmama has tried to kill me on 3 separate occasions," Jack said. "That was her way of showing you she loved you, Jackie," Teague replied. "Ugh!" Jack yelled in frustration. Jack again turned his back on Teague and focused the anger that was welling up within him on Fitzwilliam. Their swords clashed louder, and Jack suddenly became as determined to win the fight as Fitzwilliam. "Why can't anyone," Jack yelled at the top of his lungs, "just leave me," his face grew redder and redder, "alone!" Fitzwilliam's eyes grew wide, as if Jack could have seen Teague's, he would have noticed them popping as well. Neither of them had ever seen Jack act like this before. He was usually so calm and cool and collected. It was clear that he was having a little bit of an anger management issue here. His reaction took Fitzwilliam so off guard, the aristocrat tipped on some loose lines on the deck, falling against the Barnacle's port side. He was now at Jack's mercy. "Jack," Fitzwilliam said, holding up his hands. It wasn't clear what type of an appeal he was going to make. Would he apologize? Gloss this whole mutiny thing over somehow? Jack didn't care. "Don't dare say another word," Jack said. "Get up." Fitzwilliam shuffled to his feet. He was still attempting to maintain his strong, proud demeanor, but it was clear his near defeat was worrying him. "Get off my boat," Jack said, pointing his sword at Fitzwilliam's neck and breathing heavily with anger. "Now, Jack, I don't care where you go after you're off, but get off. Swim to the Royal Pains back there, swim to the East India Trading Company's slave ships, swim over to Teague and sail over to the sunset together. I don't care where the devil you go, just go. Now," Jack said. Fitzwilliam stood stock still. "Now!" Jack yelled, raising his sword and bringing it down swiftly before Fitzwilliam. This caused the aristocrat to stumble, and as he lost his balance, Jack quickly pushed him overboard using the handle of his sword. There was a dull splash. Jack didn't look overboard. He didn't want to. He sunk down on the deck, hugged his legs, and buried his face in his knees. "Nice job, Jackie," came Teague's voice from the adjoining ship. "Oh, shut up," Jack said flatly. Okay, so as you can see already, this book is getting pretty crazy, and this is going to be one of those defining moments for Jack, as this book kind of begins to help define who he is later on. Now, I want to point out one of the illustrations in this book, specifically the one on page 13, which is a really cool image of Fitzwilliam standing with an East India Trading Company flag behind, being raised behind him. I just wanted to point it out because it's really cool, and I feel like I don't highlight the illustrations in these books enough as I should. But recapping what happened here, Jack and Fitzy begin to fight, and we see that Jack's sword fighting ability has massively improved because of him watching Fitzy over the past year. But when Teague shows up, Jack starts to get angry, and we see a rare moment here of Jack letting his anger overcome him. And it is so unlike him that Fitzy literally gets scared of Jack. He orders Fitzy to get off the barnacle immediately, and he ends up pushing Fitzy over the side into the water. And afterwards, we see Jack essentially break down on the deck, and he literally goes almost into a fetal position where he hugs his legs and puts his face in his knees. And this is pretty unlike Jack, and we can obviously see that everything in this moment is really affecting him, and we don't get to see Jack like this much at all. But for me personally, when we see Jack drop his normal casual demeanor and either lash out or get really serious, or in this case, really distraught, they are some of my favorite moments for his character because it really shows the different parts of him that we don't get to see often. He's not always this carefree guy who just drinks rum all the time and makes funny jokes. I feel like that's what many people reduce him down to, and it really is a shame. In truth, Jack is a man who is shaped by countless experiences that have affected him in ways many won't ever understand. We will really dive into this more when we cover The Price of Freedom, because I think that book is the best study of Jack as a person and the things that drive his character and his motivations, and the things that he wants and everything. But for now, let's get back to the book. So Teague pulls Jack out of his moment here and reminds him the Navy is coming up on their tail pretty quickly. And Jack asks why that should concern him since he is not a pirate. But Teague says it doesn't matter what you are when the Navy blows you to bits. So Jack has two options. He can either stay on the Barnacle and probably end up dying by the Navy's cannon fire, or he can go aboard the Misty Lady with Teague and his crew and have slightly better chances. But before he can decide for himself, a few members of Teague's crew board the Barnacle. So we're going to go back into the book here. So in the book it says, "We come here to retrieve ya," said the pirate that Teague had whispered to. Now that Jack was standing next to him, he realized the pirate was quite a bit shorter than him. When the man had been standing aboard Teague's huge ship, he looked much taller. Jack had battled some towering captains during his year alone at sea, so he didn't feel at all threatened by this little man. He started to giggle. "Well, that's a novel idea, mate," Jack said. "But how, pray tell, do you plan on getting us, meaning we, meaning me and you, plus your quintet of jolly pirates here, back up on board your old ship of Teague's, while we're all down way yonder on Jack's wee Barnacle?" The pirate smirked. "Well, we got down that line, ain't we? So we'll just need to go back up it." Jack sneered. "Maybe you've got to go up it. Me, however, I have no intention of moving from my ship," Jack said proudly. "Besides, going up a line is just a mite more difficult than coming down one," Jack went on, eyeing the scrawny pirate. "So, good luck getting back up there. May the fates be with you, etc., etc." "I've already said you're coming along," said the pirate, "and Renegade Robbie don't never go back on his word." Then the man lowered his voice and added, "Especially not to Teague, mind you." "Renegade Robbie," Jack said, barely holding back laughter. "That has got to be one of the stupidest—" But before he could finish, Renegade Robbie delivered a fierce blow to his midsection, and Jack found himself laid out on the deck. Jack had been hit so hard he felt like he was going to vomit. He looked up at the pirate. There was no way a man of such slight size could pack such a punch. Jack caught his breath and leaped to his feet. Though he was still in a great deal of pain, he rushed Robbie, who without hesitation and with great ease, clenched his fist and threw another punch. This one landed Jack on his rear end and sent him skidding towards the Barnacle's railing. Jack tried to comprehend the situation. It was clear this little guy was stronger than he looked. "Now, are you thinking you'll be coming along with us? Or we're just going to have to force you a bit more," Robbie said. The 5 other members of Teague's crew who had joined Robbie stood behind him. Though they were much larger than Robbie, Jack felt less threatened by them. After all, it was clear that it was Robbie who packed the biggest wallop. Jack shrugged. "Well, seeing as I have no other option—" "I knew you'd come around," Robbie said. Jack threw his arms up in submission, but as Robbie reached out to grab him, Jack drew his sword and started slashing. Robbie whipped out twin daggers and stabbed at Jack. "Don't hurt him," Teague bellowed from the deck of his ship. Robbie immediately pulled back. "Well, why didn't you tell me that before?" Robbie asked. "I think I already done some damage to him." Before Robbie could continue his dialogue with Teague, Jack swiped at him with his sword, grazing his spiky hair and leaving him with an almost bald patch. Jack jumped on the railing and smirked at Robbie. Robbie's first instinct was to throw a fist at Jack, but Teague cleared his throat loudly, and Robbie checked himself. "Now look, boy," Robbie said, "we ain't wanting no difficulty. We just want you to come along all nice-like. We's only looking out for your own good." "Oh, my own good. It's all clear now. Had you said so in the first place, I would have gladly joined you aboard your mighty vessel. Except now, wait a minute. Does your idea of my own good entail pirating, looting, and family gatherings where everyone is very keen on playing pin the tail on Jack? Yes, I can tell by the look in your face that's exactly what you have in mind. So sorry, mate, I'm going to have to sadly decline your offer and further ask you to leave my ship," Jack said, folding his arms in defiance. Renegade Robbie looked puzzled. "So?" he said to Teague. "Not really sure what to do now. You did, after all, ask me not to hurt him, but at the same time you asked me to come and fetch him, too. Pardon, Captain, but it might be difficult to do both." Teague was clearly growing impatient, and Jack noticed his all-too-familiar temper flaring up. "Listen to me," Teague said through clenched teeth. "We have a fleet of warships that want to blow us out of the sea, and they are nary a league behind us. If the boy wants to stay aboard his boat, let him. But the rest of you, return to the ship." Jack smiled, satisfied with the way things seemed to be turning out. Robbie shrugged. "Okay, then." He shook Jack's hand. "It was nice knowing you. A pity to see such a promising pirate perish at such a young an age." "First of all, I am not a pirate," Jack said. "And further, and perhaps more important, it is ever quite presumptuous of you to assume that I am about to die." Suddenly, a huge cannon blast rocked the serene sea just a half-mile from the Barnacle and Teague's ship. Jack yelped. Robbie winked, and Jack smiled sheepishly. "So, Jack stuttered uncomfortably, "that offer you extended moments ago, you know, the one about coming aboard your ship and looking out for my best interest and whatnot?" Robbie's smile widened. "I assume that offer still stands," Jack finished. Without answering, Robbie fastened a line around his own waist, then another one around Jack's. He indicated to the other pirates who had joined him that they should reboard their own ship, and turning to Jack again, he tightened the line around his waist and said, "We've not a moment to lose, mate." So now that Jack and the rest of Teague's crew have made their way back aboard the Misty Lady, Jack sees that Teague is remarkably calm for someone who is being chased by the Navy and the EITC. But he stands there next to Teague for a little while, and neither of them speak until Jack breaks the silence. So back in the book here, Jack says, "So, we're just going to sit here? No good to see you, Jackie, how you been and whatnot?" Jack said, "Jackie, you know I was never one to think that anybody was too young for a pirate's life. It was never your age I was supposed to. You just weren't ready," Teague said. "Oh, here we go again," Jack shouted, throwing up his arms. "For your information, I did not leave your little shotgun shack in order to go pirating. I left so I would not have to ever think or hear about the vile acts of pirates ever again for as long as I lived. Here you are just thinking Jackie's not good enough to be a pirate. Why can't he be more like his cousin Valerie or grandmama? Proper pirates they be, aye, matey, and whatnot. But I was never good at it because I didn't want to be. I never said anything about you not being good at it. I just said you weren't ready," Teague repeated. "Well, 6 of this, half a dozen of that, isn't it?" "No. They're 2 very different things. You have it in you more than anyone I've ever known. And you know how many pirates I've seen come and go. When I said you weren't ready, I meant that." But before Teague could finish, another cannonball erupted beside the Misty Lady. "All hands!" Teague commanded. His crew shuffled quickly around the deck, readying their positions. Most steadied themselves behind cannons, preparing their ammunition, while the rest checked their muskets. "It's not like them to fire warning shots," Teague mused. As if in response, the fleet began to send a full-on barrage of cannonballs toward the Misty Lady. Teague's crew returned it in kind, and soon the entire sea was covered in such a thick gray cloud of gun smoke that Jack couldn't tell where the attack was coming from. The smoke was blocking out the sun. The only light came from the explosive flashes of cannon fire, which flickered and flashed like strange orange lightning. Jack had seen a lot since he left home, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. His closest point of reference was when the Barnacle had been transformed into a hulking warship called the Grand Barnacle, and he had gone head-to-head with one Navy warship. But even that single Navy vessel had caused an unimaginably loud and chaotic scene, yet it paled in comparison to the violent roar of the exploding cannons from the attacking fleet. Jack looked at Teague. His jaw was set and he looked determined, but he also looked confident. It was as if somehow he knew that he would emerge victorious from this seemingly impossible situation. Jack just thought this was further evidence that the man was mad. Then something caught Jack's eye, tearing him away from his reverie. Out in the water, he noticed a shadowy silhouette sailing among the swirling smoke clouds. At first, he thought it might be a wayward fishing boat that had been pulled into the battle. Leaning closer, he squinted his eyes to get a better look, coughing violently to clear his lungs of the heavy weight of the gunpowder he had been inhaling. His eyes were tearing, making it even more difficult to discern the exact figure of the boat, but for a moment he thought it must be the Barnacle sailing away. "The heat of the battle's getting to you, Jack," he said to himself. Then he turned north, the direction in which he had left the Barnacle. Though he couldn't see through the thick smoke, he knew the area was likely now filled with Navy ships firing away, and that a small boat like the Barnacle would never be able to withstand such a violent attack. He hung his head, remembering his lost ship. He wanted to observe a moment of silence, but he found this to be completely impossible. "Can somebody please just lower the volume on those cannons? I feel something oozing from my ears, and whereas I would usually just assume it to be runny earwax, I am fairly certain it is the telltale blood of broken eardrums," Jack shouted. As if in response, the firing quieted down considerably, before dissolving into only sporadic eruptions, and then finally settling down into an eerie calm. Jack's eyes popped open a bit. His ears were ringing so loudly that they hurt. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now we wait," Teague responded, still looking confident. "Well, if you don't mind my asking, what is it that we're waiting for?" Teague rolled his eyes, then turned to Jack. "Jackie, do you remember Sven the Vicious?" Jack wrinkled his nose and thought hard. He ran through his mental catalog of his family and their fellow pirates. "Short guy? Sort of a little bit drunk all the time?" "No, that was Stephen the Vicious. Sven, yes, now I recall. Norwegian fellow. Made quite a good rackfist. I liked it very much, even though I never really was one for fermented fish." "You've got it now, lad. That was him. Do you remember what happened to Sven, Jackie?" Teague asked, leading in toward Jack. Jack thought for a moment. They didn't force him into servitude as a cook on a Navy vessel, where he would be forbidden to ever prepare that lovely rackfist again, did they? "Almost as terrible," Teague said. "They hanged him at the docks of Port Royal under a huge sign that read, 'Pirates, ye be warned.' Who is ye, and what should he be warned of? Jack asked. Jackie, Teague said, exasperated. Be warned, or ye, meaning whosoever reads that sign, shall suffer the same fate as Sven, and Black-Eyed Susan, and Captain Lawrence Schaefer, which were all executed in the same way, hanged, for all to see, Jackie. Oh, well, that's not very pleasant, is it? Still, I wonder. How should this make me feel any more comfortable with our current situation? Jack asked. Teague smiled. It means that no matter how much of a show they were putting on just now, they would never take me, or any of my men, anything but alive. They want the pleasure of killing us themselves. They want to use us for exemplary punishment, and that always gives us an edge over them. Understand? Example what? Jack began, then stopped mid-sentence and gulped. Standing right behind Teague was a tall man in a Navy uniform. He had sneaked on so quietly that it was as though he had appeared from thin air. Jack looked to the far end of the ship and noticed that there was a reason the cannon fire had stopped. Officers from one of the vessels were slipping into skiffs and traveling through the thick smoke over to the Misty Lady, then climbing aboard. Shackle every one of these low-life scoundrels, bring them aboard, and lock them in the brig, shouted the first man to have arrived on board. From his uniform, he appeared to be an admiral. His men held their muskets to the crew and forced them to drop their own weapons. Then the officers moved to chain up the pirates. Leave him to me, the admiral said, motioning to Teague. I've waited a very long time for this. Lawrence Norrington, commanding admiral of this fleet, I presume, Teague said as his hands were being shackled. Well, it would appear even a dim-witted scoundrel like you is capable of being correct on occasion, the admiral replied. Jack's arms were pulled tightly behind him as two members of the Navy secured them with rope. Admiral Norrington walked over to Jack. And as for you, we've been keeping track of you for months now. You're quite a pirate in the making. We'll put an end to that very quickly. I am not a Jack began, but before he could finish, Norrington clapped his hands twice, indicating to his crew that the captives should be taken from the Misty Lady and brought aboard his vessel. Okay, so yes, you heard that right. Admiral Lawrence Norrington is here. But quickly, I want to go back to what Teague was talking about. When he was telling Jack about Sven the Vicious, he told Jack that he was hung off of Port Royal under a sign that said, Piracy, be warned. And yes, this is the very same sign that Jack sees at the beginning of The Curse of the Black Pearl, and he takes his hat off and salutes them. So we now know that these three pirates hanging there are Sven the Vicious, Black-Eyed Susan, and Lawrence Schaefer. But anyway, let's get back to the matters at hand. I want to talk about Lawrence Norrington, who is a Navy admiral, and you can guess by his last name who he is related to. We'll go into more detail about him a bit later, so stay tuned. But after the Navy captures Jack, Teague, and his crew, they throw them all overboard first. Then they fish them all out of the water and throw them into rowboats to bring them back to the Navy fleet nearby. Teague himself is put in the boat with Lawrence Norrington, and Jack and the rest of the crew are piled into a bunch of other boats like sardines. And once again, Jack has this feeling of dread, and despite thinking of himself as a free man who is able to sail the seas and take orders from no one, right now Jack feels like a child who needs to be looked after, according to the book. Jack knows the seriousness of this situation, and his facade just melts away, leaving him scared and alone since all his friends have left him, and Fitzwilliam betrayed him. But Jack realizes he is right next to Renegade Robbie, who tells him they won't be on the Navy ship for too long. And Jack asks Robbie how many times they've been captured, and Robbie tells him it's been over a dozen times, but they've always managed to escape thanks to Teague's quick thinking. So you can obviously tell where Jack got that skill from. But after this, the boats reach the Navy ship, and one by one, the members of Teague's crew are brought on board. Teague is brought on board last, with Lawrence Norrington behind him, and he pushes Teague forward as he falls onto the deck because of his bound hands and legs. So we're going to go back into the book and see what happens here next. So back in the book here, Lawrence Norrington says, "The previous time you evaded us was surely the last," the Admiral said. "Make fast for Tortuga," he commanded. "Admiral, are you sure that's—" an officer began to question. "What this is, Lewis, is an order," the Admiral said sternly through clenched teeth. "Aye, sir," the officer said, saluting. Then the Admiral turned back toward Teague. He stuck his sword beneath Teague's chin, forcing the pirate to look him in the eyes. "There is no better place to deter piracy than its safest haven in the Caribbean. Tortuga is a pirate town, rampant with your kind, filled with misery and corruption. You'll enjoy your final visit there, I'm sure. It will last mere minutes, and then you'll be hanging from the gallows on display for all to see, a warning to those who might dare follow in your footsteps. With these last few words, the Admiral shot Jack a warning glance. We've been down this road before, haven't we? Teague said. The Admiral looked back at Teague with utter disdain. Then he scowled and spat swiftly in the pirate's face. Take them all to the brig, the Admiral ordered. Lock them up until we make landfall in Tortuga. As for him, the Admiral motioned to Teague, throw him in the same brig as the rest of the common slime. Now that he's aboard, there's no need to administer special treatment to this sea slug. Jack and the rest of the crew, with Teague in front, were marched below decks and thrown into the brig. The men each had less than a foot of space between them, and as the gate was closed by the guard, Jack heard an unearthly howl coming from the far end of the cell. One of the pirate's hands had been crushed in the gate as the guard closed it. The pirate held his broken, limp hand by the wrist. Alright, so now everyone's in the brig, but after this, once they're all in there, one of Teague's crew steps on someone's foot, and before we know it, a fight begins to break out in the cell, and many of the crew are able to break free of their bonds in this fight, and one of them even gnaws off Jack's bonds with his teeth. But someone yells out for everyone to quiet down, and Teague recognizes the voice. So let's find out who it is. So in the book it says, then a shout erupted from outside the brig. Stop it all right now or we'll hang the lot of you, we will. The crowd in the brig settled down. Jack noticed a look of recognition on Teague's face at the sound of the voice. Teague began slowly pushing his way toward the front of the brig. When he got there, he looked the man on the other side straight in the face and smiled. Well, well, if it's not Mr. Joshamee Gibbs, Teague said. At your service, sir, the man said, straightening his Navy uniform and smiling back. Jack was surprised to see Teague talking to a Navy officer, and even more surprised that the Navy officer was talking back, and most surprised that the Navy officer was smiling at Teague. What in heaven's name is going on here? Jack asked. What you mean? Renegade Robbie asked. He had made his way over to Jack's side when the brawl had settled down. For all his part in the fight, Robbie seemed largely unscathed, save a tiny bump on his left eye. Teague, Navy officer talking, nicely nice. Explain, Jack said. Oh, right. Well, that's Mr. Gibbs. Jack looked back toward Mr. Gibbs. He didn't look like a pirate, but with his Navy uniform and relatively trim sideburns. He was a stout man with a shock of auburn hair and a face that Jack suspected looked older than it really was. At the same time, he didn't look entirely like a Navy officer either. His sideburns might have been trim for a pirate, but they were a tad bushy for an officer. His uniform looked a bit more disheveled than the rest of the Navy crews as well. So, this Mr. Gibbs, Jack said, why is he being so nice to the prisoners? Well, you see, Robbie explained, Mr. Gibbs likes to move the drink along, not only down on his own hatch, but on the Caribbean too. Sells it, he does. And we pirates really like our freedom. In addition, as I'm sure you already know, we have some connections with the runners down on Rum Runners Island. So let's just say we furnish Mr. Gibbs with an endless supply of something he loves and sells, and he makes sure we stay free to keep on supplying it. Jack stared blankly at Robbie. So, your ability to remain free resides in the hands of a rum trafficker smitten with the drink? Jack asked. Never thought of it that way. But yeah, I guess that would be correct, Robbie said. Jack was beginning to realize that being a pirate was less about thinking things through and more about acting on gut instinct. Hey, it's worked out this far, ain't it? Robbie pointed out, noticing Jack's expression of disbelief. Yet again, Jack was unable to argue this point with Robbie. Jack excused himself and made his way toward Teague. When he arrived at his side, Mr. Gibbs' jaw dropped. It can't be, can it? Mr. Gibbs asked. Jack stared blankly at Mr. Gibbs, who now had a wide smile beaming across his face. It can be if you want it to, but if you don't, it might still be, in which case you would be correct, except for the fact that I have no idea who you're talking about, mate. So I find it impossible to confirm. Sorry, Jack replied. Aha! Mr. Gibbs blurted out. It is! No other boy is so clever. Jackie, last time I saw you, you were yay high. Mr. Gibbs indicated about a meter from the floor with his hand. You must be mistaking me for another Jackie who was about yay high last time you saw him, because I, sir, have never seen you before in my life. Jack suddenly felt a swift slap upside the head. He looked up to see Teague scowling at him. Jackie, is that any way to treat an old family friend? Jack squinted at Gibbs. Ah, yes, Mr. Gibbs, sure, yes, of course, I remember you now. You were at that barbecue, Mr. Gibbs finished for Jack. Yes, that barbecue we had down on Rum Runner's Island, Mr. Gibbs finished again. Yes, of course. Where else? We were celebrating your grandmama's 74th birthday. Jack stopped for a moment and mumbled, That old bat has lived thrice as long as she's deserved to. Jack felt another slap upside his head and knew without looking that it came from Teague. Listen, Joshamee, Teague said. We need to find a way out of here. You're always good on your word, and you know we stay good on ours, if you know what I mean. Yes, loyalty. A mighty strange trait for pirates such as yourselves. Still, it's going to be mighty tricky this time. The Admiral has brought his son aboard, for Lord knows what reason, and security's exceptionally tight, Mr. Gibbs said. Joshamee, Teague said slowly and deliberately, we all know how much you love your rum and the ability to trade it. And we also know how much it would bother you to lose your endless access to said beverage. I do love it, Mr. Gibbs said dreamily, and I love the doubloons it brings me just as well. I am running a tad low at the current time, with the cost of bribing guards, freeing pirates constantly increasing and whatnot. Mr. Gibbs, Teague said, sounding very official, will you be helping us, or will we have to explore other avenues to secure our release? Gibbs sighed. Let me see what I can do, he said. A drunk, seeing what he can do. Very reassuring indeed, Jack muttered. All right, well, I teased it at the end of the last episode, but here he is, Joshamee Gibbs himself. I think this is great as it ties in Gibbs as a family friend, which ends up explaining why he ends up being so loyal to Jack later on. And as we can see, he is still a Navy crewman here, like we see at the beginning of The Curse of the Black Pearl. But we find out Gibbs is a rum trafficker on the side and has an agreement with Teague to let them go for rum in return. And if you caught what Gibbs said earlier, he said the Admiral brought his son aboard. I'll let you ponder who that might be for a little while. But anyway, it's now nighttime on the ship, and Teague's crew is fast asleep in the brig. Everyone is asleep except for Jack and Teague, and a little while later, the door to the brig opens up, and Gibbs tells Teague to wake his men and head out quietly. So the crew begins to make their way out of the cell, and Robbie tells Jack that Teague has ordered him to watch over him. And as everyone is escaping, we find out how Gibbs pulled this off, as Jack sees a cell full of Navy sailors fully unconscious from too much rum. So Gibbs then leads them up to the main deck, and he points to a skiff that is tied to the ship's broadside. Jack gets in first, and then the rest of the crew makes their way in. And then once everyone's inside, Gibbs salutes them before he cuts the lines and lets the skiff fall into the water. Once they're off the ship, Jack notices the rest of the fleet has withdrawn, but something catches his eye. In the distance, Jack sees the Barnacle, which had survived the battle earlier. But what gets Jack enraged is the flag he sees flying from his ship. On the Barnacle, the flag of the East India Trading Company is flying. And this is when we get a quick description of what is going on in Jack's head. So the book says, the East India Trading Company was in the business of trading spices and fine linens. They were also, Jack had recently discovered, in the business of trafficking people, something Jack had absolutely no tolerance for. Jack also knew the company was in league with the Royal Navy, and the two had joined together with the sole good of wiping pirates off the face of the earth. A year ago, Jack might have agreed with them, but since setting off on his own, Jack was beginning to have second thoughts about good and evil, piracy and conformity, and in the world of material things, what exactly belonged to whom. That was his boat. He had found it. He had taken it on adventure after adventure. No one else, no man, no captain, no king, no company would fly their flag on his boat. So in his fit of rage, Jack jumps off the skiff and he begins to swim toward the Barnacle. And once he reaches it, he immediately climbs up on the mast and rips the flag down. But Jack realizes he's not alone. Someone had to have put up the flag, and that person is none other than Fitzwilliam. So let's go back into the book and see what happens here. So it says, Fitzwilliam drew his sword. I have been waiting for this moment a long time, Jack, he said. You have no idea how infuriating it has been for me, sailing aboard your wretched little boat, taking your orders. I think I have some sort of idea, Jack said. After all, I was quite disgusted having you aboard, and you may have thought you had me fooled, but I say the pigeons, Fitzy, the pigeons. Fitzwilliam snarled. You are as mad as ever. What in the good earth's name are you talking about? "Oh, don't play dodo bird with me, Fitz," Jack said casually. "I remember a number of occasions while we were sailing with nothing else much going on, and you were playing around with the birds, talking to them all daintily like you were some princess in a fairy tale. You even mentioned that your father was sort of a birder, which I thought was an odd hobby for an aristocrat. You, however, had it all planned out. I knew something was amiss, and I was on the verge of finding out exactly what it was when your Royal Navy and East India Trading Company pals dropped in on us. Those birds were carrying messages to your lads over there, weren't they?" Jack continued. "You were tracking my moves. Thing is, in the end, it wasn't you or your spying on the birdies that found Teague. It was the Navy and the company. Without your help. All you succeeded in doing was bringing Teague and me together again, and I say that was purely coincidence." Fitzwilliam sneered. "But had you not run away, Teague would not have been searching for you, and hence would not have run afoul of the Navy," Fitzwilliam said flatly. "Who says he was looking for me, mate?" Jack asked. "Regardless," Fitzwilliam said, "in the process of sailing with you, I have come to know you and your tricks and your pirate friends, and to that end, I believe I have delivered a more valuable prize than even Teague. You are wily, smarmy, and untrustworthy, Jack Sparrow." "Why, thank you," Jack replied. "I do believe that's the kindest compliment you've ever paid me. And if you think I'm going to allow you to flee after having just captured you, you are sadly mistaken." Fitzwilliam raised his sword and Jack drew his. In moments, the two boys were clashing, their weapons clanking away, glistening under the pale moonlight. Jack quickly jumped on a barrel in which the crew had kept salted fish and was immediately followed by Fitzwilliam, who sprung out on the balustrade. Fitzwilliam swung at Jack's legs, and Jack jumped, just barely avoiding the swipe. Jack jumped backward off the barrel, landing on the deck. He grabbed a ballast and swung it above his head multiple times to gain momentum. Then he let it fly, and it struck Fitzwilliam directly in the gut. Fitzwilliam fell to the deck, and Jack rushed over to him and pointed his sword at Fitzwilliam's neck. A small smirk spread over his lips as he stood over the other boy. "I hope you do not believe it would be so easy to overcome me," Fitzwilliam said. Steadying himself with his arms, he quickly pushed himself out from underneath Jack. Fitzwilliam jumped up and began another fierce assault, relentlessly swiping away at Jack. "However did you come in possession of this ship anyway, Fitzy?" Jack said casually, acting as if he were not on the receiving end of a full-on assault. "Some advice. In the future, check the waters around your boat before you decide the man you have sent overboard is done for. I simply spent some time clinging to this disgusting little vessel before reclaiming it once you had abandoned ship." "Would you mind terribly answering why you want it so badly if it's such a disgusting vessel?" Jack retorted, even as he fended off Fitzwilliam's blows. "For evidence, of course. It will be slightly more difficult convincing a boy of your age of piracy than someone of, say, Teague's stature and renown," Fitzwilliam said. For some reason, this made Jack furious. He began to let loose on Fitzwilliam like a berserker. "For the last blasted time," Jack said, "I am not a pirate. I am not going to be convicted of anything, for I am guilty of nothing, and I want you to get off my ship for good." "And I will tell you, for the last time," Fitzwilliam said, "that I am taking this ship in as evidence. I am taking you back to where you belong, specifically to the brig of Admiral Norrington's ship, and if I can manage, I will alert them to the fact that your supposed father is on the run yet again." The two boys fought furiously. It was unlike the bickering and bantering that Jack and Fitzwilliam had engaged in during their adventures on the Seven Seas. This was filled with venom and animosity and rage from both sides. Fitzwilliam lunged and took a swing at Jack, shredding the edges of his bandana. Jack was relieved that Fitzwilliam had missed his neck, but still felt the blow was a little too close for comfort. Jack jumped into the rigging, holding fast to it with one hand, while battling away with Fitzwilliam with the other. And then it happened. Fitzwilliam hit Jack with a blow that knocked Jack's sword right out of his hand. Now Jack was weaponless, facing Fitzwilliam who was in possession of both of their swords. "Now, Fitzy, let's calm down. Remember all the good times we've had together? Mermaids, pirates, storm kings," Jack said. "Oh, do not even attempt to," Fitzwilliam began. But before he could finish, Jack had taken the opportunity provided by the brief pause for conversation and tackled Fitzwilliam. Fitzwilliam's sword flew from his hand, though he was still holding on to Jack's. Reaching out, Jack grabbed Fitzwilliam's sword, and once again armed, the two continued to spar. "Well, now I know why you're such an expert swordsman," Jack said. "Quite a lot easier to parry with this sword than the old rusty one I've been working with all this time." It was true. Jack could tell that Fitzwilliam's ability to spar was significantly lessened while he was holding Jack's sword. Jack's ability, however, felt near perfect with Fitzwilliam's sword in his hand. Jack felt as though he was battling in a manner that was superior to Fitzwilliam's at his best. and his insights were soon validated. After some minutes of intense sparring, Jack was able to knock the sword from Fitzwilliam's hand. He had Fitzwilliam on the ground, his foot on his chest. Jack was glowing. He was triumphant. He had won back his ship, and better yet, he had this mutinous traitor at his disposal and could deal with the situation however he saw fit. He thought back to the very first time he had met Fitzwilliam and how the aristocrat, if that part of Fitzwilliam's story were even true, had won his place aboard the Barnacle. Jack could not deny that he had begun to, if not trust, then at the very least, accept Fitzwilliam's presence aboard his boat. All that, and now this outright betrayal. Worse than a betrayal, really. After all, Jack had been monitored and watched and spied upon for months. He decided that throwing Fitzwilliam overboard was letting him off easy. Jack lifted his sword, and an expression of terror formed on Fitzwilliam's face. Even in the moonlight, Jack could see that Fitzwilliam had gone pale. Jack smirked. But when he went to bring down his sword, the most peculiar thing happened. Jack found he was unable to move his arm. He tried and tried, but something was preventing him from doing so. Then he felt a tugging on his arm. He turned slowly and found Teague standing there. The captain's hand was clenched tightly around Jack's wrist. "I don't think that would be the best idea, Jackie," Teague said. "Yes, well, he stole my boat," Jack said. "And you took it from someone else," Teague reminded him. "It was abandoned," Jack screamed back. "And so it was," Teague nodded. "Well, it might just be that the men like this aristocratic fop over here have different ideas about property and possessing it than men like you and me." "Well, that's all well and fine, except I am not like you," Jack said. Teague gave Jack a knowing glance. "Besides, Fitzwilliam betrayed me," Jack said, grasping at straws now. "Betrayal is another concept that men like him think differently about than men like us. Do you know how many times I've been betrayed by members of my crew?" Teague asked. "Can't say I do," Jack said flatly. "Well, neither do I. But it's been quite a lot. Half the men I'm sailing with now have at least one time or another turned against me for the sake of their own interests. It's what we do. Savvy?" Teague said. Fitzwilliam, noticing the similarity in Teague and Jack's speech, was not going to let an opportunity to take a dig pass him by. "I say, if ever there were two pirates more similar—" "Oh, shut up!" Teague and Jack shouted at Fitzwilliam simultaneously. "So if we're not going to feed him to the fishies," Jack said, "then what do we do with him?" "Leave that to me," Teague said with a devilish grin. So Jack and Teague are now standing over Fitzwilliam, and Teague orders Fitzy to go below decks. And what catches Jack's attention is how Fitzy obeys Teague's orders immediately and does what he's told. And once Fitzy is below decks, Jack takes the helm of the Barnacle and begins to sail it toward the Misty Lady. But out of nowhere, a cannonball lands in the water near the Barnacle, and they notice it is from Lawrence Norrington's ship. Teague immediately has a plan and orders Jack to bring Fitzy above deck, as they'll be abandoning ship and swimming over to Norrington's ship. So the three of them swim over to the Navy vessel, and they climb aboard as the crew is too distracted firing on the Barnacle. Teague instructs Jack and Fitzy to follow him, and soon after, they make their way into a weapons storeroom. Teague and Jack grab swords, and Teague orders Fitzy to go out and do some reconnaissance. Fitzy does as Teague says, which once again blows Jack's mind, as Fitzy never blindly followed Jack's commands before. But the two of them hear footsteps approaching, and once they hide, we see Lawrence Norrington enter the room with his son. So we're going to go back to the book here, and I guess you can probably understand what's about to happen here, but let's find out. The door creaked open, and Admiral Lawrence Norrington entered. Trailing closely behind him, hanging onto his coattails, was a young boy, about 10 years younger than Jack. "James," Admiral Norrington said, "please refrain from tugging upon my waistcoat." The boy looked down, ashamed. He was clearly frightened by all the goings-on aboard the ship, and every time a blast resounded he attempted to hide behind the Admiral, who in turn was having none of it. The Admiral squatted beside the boy and held him by the shoulders. "You need to be brave, son. There are men out there who are savages, and they want to destroy you and your entire way of life. They are uncivilized, heathen, thieving, filthy pirates, and when I have gone on to final rest, it is you who will carry on the banner of civility and order, and help the Crown and our allies in the East India Trading Company eradicate their slime from the seven seas." As if in response, just as the Admiral finished, a tremendous explosion rocked the boat. The boy began to sob, and his father slapped him across the face, telling him to come to his senses and act like a man. Officers flooded the ammunition store, all shouting simultaneously. Norrington quickly called for an order. The men quieted down, and soon all that could be heard was the boys sobbing. "Now, Lieutenant Shepard, full report," said the Admiral. A distinguished-looking man in a uniform stepped forward and clicked his heels together. "Sir, our bowsprit's been hit by cannon fire from the Misty Lady. We are not sure how much damage was sustained," the man reported. Norrington looked enraged. "Well, then, why are you all standing here? Go! Survey the damage! And then storm the Misty Lady and retrieve for me that low-life Captain Teague and his pint-sized protege." "Protege?" Jack scowled, taking great offense. Just then, the small room's door swung open once more. "There will be no need for that, good sirs," a familiar voice filled the room. Teague cringed and tried to mouth something to Jack. Then the pirate started to gesticulate wildly, but Jack couldn't tell if he were telling him to hide himself more thoroughly or jump up and run out of the room. Before Jack could decide what to do, he felt someone grabbing him by the hair and pulling him out of his hiding place behind the barrel. Jack craned his neck and saw Fitzwilliam. He was obviously not beholden to whatever Teague or Jack demanded of him any longer. "Your captives are here, gentlemen," he said, "and I believe you owe me a great many doubloons, and even more respect for their safe delivery." Jack heard the cocking of what sounded like 1,000 rifles, which were soon pointed directly at him and Teague. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Caribbean, and Jack was certain he would not live to see the noonday sun. Okay, so here is character appearance number 2, and that is none other than James Norrington. I'll be honest with you, when I was first reading this and we saw the mention of Lawrence Norrington at the beginning, I was like, oh my god, is this like Norrington's dad? And then we get to this part and he says James, and I'm like, oh my god, it actually is his dad, and James Norrington is here. Like, it's so cool. But James is very young here, and he's 10 years younger than Jack. And remember that Jack is probably around 18 years old here, I would say. So James Norrington's probably like 7 or 8. And ever since I read this book for the first time, I have not been able to get over how much of a terrible father Lawrence Norrington is to James. James is obviously very scared by all the gunfire and chaos happening outside. And what does his father do? He slaps James in the face and tells him to stop crying and act like a man. This just makes me appreciate James Norrington even more. You all know I love him, and this abuse he receives from his father, especially at such a young age, is probably why James is so stern and has such a hatred for pirates when we meet him in The Curse of the Black Pearl. But anyway, to move on, Fitzy has betrayed Jack again here, no surprise, and Jack and Teague are taken from their hiding places, and Lawrence Norrington steps toward them. And now buckle up. We got a long reading coming up here, but I didn't want to split it up. There's just too much that happens here, and I want to cover everything in full. So get ready. Here we go. Back into the book. "I would not hesitate to send you to Davy Jones' locker right now," Admiral Norrington said flatly. The boy alongside him shivered, evidently startled by the guns and the sudden appearance of 2 pirates. Jack realized that with all the terrible stories the Admiral had been feeding the boy about pirates, the child must have been terrified of him and Teague. This gave Jack the brilliant idea to screw up his nose, make his eyes go all evil, and bare his teeth, causing the boy to jump and grip the Admiral's coat before shrinking away from Jack and his startling countenance. "Someone without hesitation would have done away with us already, would they not have?" Teague asked evenly. Stifling a roar of rage, the Admiral grabbed one of his men's bayonets and jabbed its blade beneath Teague's chin. "As I can't trust you not to escape before we arrive in Tortuga, we shall have to make do with the means for execution at our disposal here and now. Jermaine!" the Admiral barked. "Yes, sir." A heavy-set sailor leaped to the Admiral's side. "Wake the remaining crew and call them to the forecastle. Shepard, march these 2 poor excuses for men to the deck." Then he turned to look down at the boy. "James, come with me. You are about to witness something I pray you will never forget." With those words ringing in their ears, Jack and Teague were shoved toward the stairs leading to the deck. The Admiral and his men followed close behind, with the frightened boy tagging along. "Move out quick or I'll slam you in the kisser," a particularly surly officer shouted, nudging Jack in the back with the butt of a musket. "I'm deeply flattered, but you're not quite my type," Jack replied. "Move it," the officer barked, battling Jack in the backside with the gun. They emerged onto the deck where the crew had gathered, mostly in their night clothes. A few officers were recovering from the powerful grip sleep recently held over them, nodding off and yawning loudly. The Admiral pushed through the men, dragging the boy behind him like a rag doll. "Gentlemen, my wish was that we would have the luxury of performing this act in its appropriate place," landing at Tortuga. But luxuries and wishes are things reserved for the idle-minded and slothful. We're at the natural order of things. Oh, silence your muzzle and get on with it, will ya? A voice shouted, and Jack was certain that it was Mr. Gibbs. A few chuckles erupted from the crowd. The Admiral looked furious, but remained decidedly steadfast in his resolve. He cleared his throat and continued. As I was saying, we're at the natural order of things to have men dressed like, ahem. He nodded disgustedly toward Jack and Teague. We would be living in a world swarming with flies and overrun with lice. Were it acceptable for men to behave as these men behave, we would be living in not a world governed by order and the divine-inspired laws of the crown, but in complete and utter anarchy. Were it the will of the Almighty that men dabble in strange and bizarre rituals and adorn themselves with Chitsney jewels, then these men would be upstanding citizens. Were it that you would shut up, I might be able to avoid this throbbing headache, Jack said, and Teague, along with some of the officers, couldn't prevent himself from smirking. Silence! The Admiral commanded. Jack straightened his back dramatically. Were all those things the reasonable lay of our land and sea, we would not be compelled to do what we are about to do. The Admiral turned to Teague. He held out his hand, and an officer placed a rolled scroll into his open palm. Lawrence Norrington unrolled it and held it out ceremoniously. The pirate known as Teague, be it known that you have been charged, tried, and convicted for— Wait, just one moment, Jack said. What's all this charged, tried, and convicted business? Perhaps it's just me, but I don't recall anyone doing any charging or trying or convicting here. The Admiral shot Jack a scowling glance. Fine, the Admiral said flatly. The pirate known as Teague, you are charged with piracy, the Admiral said. Very well then, Jack said. But what about the trying and convicting bit? Gentlemen, the Admiral shouted to his crew, is this man, known as Teague, guilty of piracy? Will there be a hanging if he is? A strong voice rang out from the crowd. More likely a plank walking, as I would rather not dirty my craft with pirate death. Almost as good, that. Guilty! The voice shouted, and was joined quickly by the rest of the crew. The Admiral smiled smarmily, and Jack gulped. Now, if I may continue, the Admiral said. The floor is all yours, mate, Jack said, motioning with a resigned acceptance. You have been tried and convicted for your willful commission of crimes against the Crown, said crimes being infinite in quantity and sinister in nature, the most egregious of those to be cited herewith. Piracy, threatening members of the Royal Navy with their own weapons, threatening members of the Royal Navy with your weapons, theft of a gaggle of geese from a wading pond outside of Boston, threatening members of the Royal Navy with said gaggle of geese, looting, arson, theft of a Royal Navy vessel, possessing an unlawful quantity of barley and hops, pillaging, cavorting with soothsayers, extortion, smuggling, and for these crimes you have been sentenced to be executed by hanging, or just generally killed somehow in the event that he who is officiating the execution does not care to sully his ship. I have a strange feeling you had added that last part about the ship sullying and all, Jack said. Keep silent, the Admiral barked. The execution will take place at dawn. Oh, look, the sun seems to be creeping up over the horizon already. I suppose we needn't waste any more time, then. I must beg one more question first, Jack said snidely. What is it that I've been charged, tried, and convicted of? Guilty by association, the Admiral said. Hear, hear! A voice that sounded like Fitzwilliam's rang out. Men, secure the prisoner's hands and ready the plank, the Admiral said. A general milling about occurred on deck as men tried to make way for their preparations. Teague and Jack were brought to a clear spot on the deck where they were to be prepared for plank walking. Teague looked up and smiled slightly. The man binding their hands so they could not struggle was none other than Mr. Gibbs. Sorry about all this, Gibbs whispered. Why didn't you just flee when you were off the ship? Teague glanced down at Jack, only slightly irritated. Jack thought that Teague seemed to be enjoying this whole hullabaloo a great deal. Mr. Gibbs tugged on their bonds. To Jack's surprise, they were tied tight. There is nothing I can do. They'd suspect me if I gave you any more slack. Pray for your souls, but with only your thumb and your index finger pressed tightly together, Mr. Gibbs said mysteriously, and with that, he walked away. Jack thought that this must truly be the end. There was no way out of this bind. After all he'd been through, after all the mermaids and pirate kings, cursed swords and time-bending watches, it would end like this, walking a plank on an ordinary Navy ship. Up you go, the Admiral commanded. Jack and Teague ascended to the plank. Good riddance, Teague, the Admiral said. And good riddance to you as well, Teague responded with the air of a man who refused to die with anything but dignity. Walk, the Admiral commanded flatly. Teague began to walk the plank slowly, but evenly and steadily, without hesitation. Jack watched the pirate with a strange mix of consternation and regret. He was angry with the Navy for what they were doing to Teague, but he was also bothered by the fact that now he and Teague would never be able to make amends, and most importantly, Jack would never find out what it really was he wanted to do with his life. Teague finally reached the end of the plank and dropped off. Jack had his eyes closed in anticipation of the telltale splash that would follow. His mind was racing, fixing on how long it would take a man with bound hands to drown out in the middle of the sea. Then something happened, or didn't happen, rather. The splash Jack was waiting for never came. The Admiral noticed this, too. He pushed away the boy, who had been clinging to his coat, and stormed onto the plank. He walked to the very edge, scanning the water below for traces of the pirate. Then he knelt down on the plank and peered behind it. But before he could get a good look, something swung up from underneath the plank and hit the Admiral. It was Teague. He had somehow escaped his bonds and managed to grab the plank as he fell. Then as the Admiral inspected the water, Teague had hoisted himself up onto the plank behind him. Quicker than Jack might have expected, the Admiral had pulled his sword. Teague had stolen another one from a soldier, and Norrington and Teague were dueling. A chaotic ruckus erupted, and Jack felt relieved that he wouldn't have to walk the plank, for the moment, at least. Psst! Jack heard someone call from behind him. There's a loose bit of rope between your forefinger and your thumb. Catch it and pull if you can, and you'll be freed. Jack turned to see the wide, yellow smile of Mr. Gibbs, who winked at him. Jack quickly did as Mr. Gibbs had suggested, and the bonds came free. That was how Teague must have freed himself as well. Mr. Gibbs slyly slipped Jack's sword back to him. Armed, Jack pushed through the crowd upon the ship in search of one person. "Not so quickly, worm!" came a voice from behind him. It was just the person he had been looking for, Fitzwilliam. "I had no intention of attempting an escape," Jack said, realizing that it was actually had crossed his mind before he settled on attacking Fitzwilliam. Fitzwilliam began furiously striking away at Jack, who deflected the blows with his own sword. At first, the sleepy Navy crew seemed strangely ambivalent as the two pairs of sword-fighting sailors danced around the ship. Then Jack realized that some of the officers had begun to fight among themselves. Jack thought this was strange. He hadn't much experience with the Navy, but he knew them to be loyal to each other, or at least the very least, to the Crown, in a way that pirates were not. Then one of the Navy sailors charged past Jack, who quickly recognized the sailor's crooked-toothed smile and tattoos as belonging to renegade Robbie. Jack smirked. While Teague had been on the Barnacle, the rest of his crew had gone back to the Misty Lady. But now, about a dozen of his crew had come back and infiltrated the Navy ship. They were posing as members of the Navy. "Closer, you dolts! Closer still!" Robbie yelled. Jack could see that Robbie was calling out to the Misty Lady, which was being crewed by the handful of pirates that remained aboard the pirate ship, if the lady could get close enough. Just then, a rapid firing of cannons blasted from the port side of the ship. Jack gasped, his eyes wide. He had feared it before, but this time it had actually happened. The cannon fire, meant for the Misty Lady, had blown the Barnacle to bits. He watched as his boat split into multiple pieces, the mast burning, the deck collapsing on itself. Jack felt a very large lump develop in his throat, and to add insult to injury, at that moment he was whacked with a serious blow to the shoulder. His distraction had allowed Fitzwilliam an advantage. Jack fell to the deck, while all around him the battle raged between the crews. Fitzwilliam smiled. "I have waited patiently for quite some time to do this," Fitzwilliam said. At the very moment, a cry of anguish rang out, overpowering all their noise in the ship. "Uncle!" Fitzwilliam shouted. Jack looked confused for a moment, then realized that Fitzwilliam was talking about the Admiral. Fitzwilliam must have been Norrington's nephew. It was Admiral Norrington who had shouted out in pain. He had been hit hard by Teague. Now Jack took advantage of Fitzwilliam's being distracted, delivering a blow that sent Fitzwilliam to the ground. The two boys were so tired from their battle that neither could find it in themselves to move from the deck. From this vantage point, Jack noticed the Admiral's son had rushed to his father's side. Then, Jack noticed something else. The boy was backing away from Teague, terrified, but he was backing into a gap in the balustrade. If Jack didn't do something, the boy would fall into the sea. Jack thought about this for a moment. Like Fitzwilliam, the boy was related to the Admiral. It was his son. But did that mean nothing good could come from him? He was just a boy, with a whole life ahead of him. He could find his own way. And wasn't it wrong to punish a child for the sins of his father? Isn't that what Jack was trying to prevent happening with respect to himself and Teague? Jack decided to muster all the energy he could and run toward the boy in order to prevent him from backing off the ship. But Jack's actions only scared the boy further. He was clearly terrified at the sight of a teenager who looked like, acted like, and cavorted with a pirate, running after him. The boy lost his footing and tumbled into the water. Jack gasped. "James!" the Admiral shouted. When no one made a move to help, Teague sighed. He delivered a strong blow to the Admiral and leaped off the ship. Jack leaned over the railing and strained to see what was going on. Down below, Jack could see Teague swimming frantically, but there was no boy in sight. Then Jack saw Teague dip below the water, re-emerging moments later with the boy, who appeared to be unconscious. "There's a ladder right by you," Robbie shouted to Teague, who probably couldn't see the ship clearly, due to the rays of the rising sun behind it. Teague struggled to grip the ladder with his free hand, then ascended to the deck. He quickly threw the boy down and began to resuscitate him. Fitzwilliam hurried to the boy's side. "James! If he is dead," Fitzwilliam began. "What?" Jack said, clearly having had enough of the back and forth. "What will you do, Fitzy? Mind you, none of us has put this child in danger. It was you and that unkie of yours over there. Bringing a kid like that into a battle seems like a very wise decision now, does it?" "Oh, don't bother answering that question. It's just like you people to put anyone around you at risk, even a child. And for what, Fitzy? For what?" "You were a filthy pirate," Fitzwilliam said, his face so red it looked as though it would blister. "Thank goodness for that, if this is the way you not piratey people treat each other," Jack replied. Just then, the boy began to cough. Teague nodded to his crew the boy would be okay. From across the deck, the Admiral began to shout. "Saved by a pirate, James! You stupid brat! You should have let yourself drown, boy. I would rather have that than a Norrington smeared with the taint of being indebted to a pirate." Jack thought this was just a little bit extreme. He shot a sneer in the Admiral's general direction. The Navy crew was defeated. The cannon fire had ceased, and most of the men were laid out on the deck. Robbie yelled out the Misty Lady was now alongside the Navy ship, and Teague's men began to shoot grappling hooks from one boat to another to reboard. "I trust you'll think twice before deciding to try your luck with me again," Teague said to the wounded Admiral. "And if you do plan on making another advance, please do leave the children behind." Then Teague motioned to Jack. "Come on, Jackie." Jack gave Fitzwilliam an angry and perhaps even disappointed look. Then he and Teague each grabbed a line and swung back onto the Misty Lady, leaving the defeated naval crew and their battered ship behind them. All right, I know that was a lot, but let's focus on Norrington here. First, we find out Fitzwilliam is Lawrence Norrington's nephew, so that makes Fitzy James Norrington's cousin. But we also get this moment between James and his father after Teague rescues James. And once Teague finds out James is all right, Lawrence Norrington says the absolute worst thing ever to his own son. I'll read it one more time. "Saved by a pirate, James. You stupid brat. You should have let yourself drown, boy. I would rather have that than a Norrington smeared with the taint of being indebted to a pirate." Unbelievable. When I first read this, I was shocked at the thought of a father saying this to their own son. Like, Lawrence Norrington is just an absolutely terrible father. Also, in all the madness, it finally happened. The Barnacle was blown to bits from cannon fire. And this time, there's no undead conquistador or magic sword to bring it back. The Barnacle is truly gone. And after all this time. So let's give one last salute to the Barnacle. But after all this craziness, Jack, Teague, and the rest of the crew head back to the Misty Lady, leaving Fitzwilliam, Lawrence Norrington, and James Norrington behind. And now we're at the tail end of this book. And let me say, Fitzy will not be returning for the rest of the series. This is the last time we see Fitzwilliam. He doesn't come up in the last two books. So we're bidding farewell to Fitzy forever. So Teague walks over to Jack, and who is still dealing, of course, with the loss of the Barnacle, and he asks Jack if he's doing all right. Finally, a decent interaction between these two. But Teague sits down and tells Jack the reason he had told Jack he wasn't ready to be out at sea with him was not because he wasn't capable. It was because he hadn't figured out what it meant to be a pirate. And Jack still thinks of the loss of his crew and his ship and asks Teague, "Isn't this what being a pirate is all about?" And Teague replies and tells him yes, but it is also many other things as well. He tells Jack, boats, ships, crews, they will all come and go. You have yourself to look out for, and only yourself. That doesn't mean you don't do those things you know are right, specifically these things that are right for you. Teague then asks if Jack wants to come back with him, but Jack refuses, and this time Teague respects his decision, and he originally plans to drop Jack off on Tortuga, but Jack asks him if there's anywhere else they could take him, and they finally settle on Isla Hermosa, and Jack reluctantly agrees. But Teague has a parting gift for Jack, so let's find out what that is. So Teague says, "Oh, and you might want to take this." Teague slipped a ring off his right index finger. Jack was taken aback and quickly tried to hide his own hands. "It's okay, Jackie. I know you took one of my rings before you left town. But Tia Dama said you were looking for me. Looking for it. I had it confused with another ring. This one." Jack's eyes grew wide. "This was the one you wanted, wasn't it? The one with that most unique property." "What are you talking about? I know nothing about a ring with a most unique property," Jack said loudly for the sake of his crew. "So this is the one that can control people and make them do your bidding, eh?" Jack continued out of the corner of his mouth, so only Teague could hear. "Yes, Jackie, but be warned. It's only worked twice. Once 7 years ago when I was fending off an angry washerwoman, and again a few hours ago when we were in that process of securing your boat from that backstabbing mate of yours." Jack's eyes were wide, curious, and a little bit skeptical as he examined the ring. So this is how Teague got Fitzwilliam to obey his orders aboard the Barnacle. Jack figured that the ring's power must eventually worn off, which would be how Fitzwilliam was able to betray Jack and Teague's location. "So, how do I know when it's going to work and when it's not, you know?" Teague shrugged. There doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to any of it. So in other words, it'd be wise not to rely on it. Jack slipped the ring on his finger. It immediately slipped off. Teague's fingers were much bigger than Jack's. Even the ring Jack had swiped from Teague before was bridged with floss. Jack stuck the ring on his thumb instead, where it remained secure. "Well, thank you." Jack fidgeted with the first ring. Do you want this other one back?" Jack asked. "Eventually. Not now." Jack wondered what that was supposed to mean. Then, as if he hadn't just been talking to Jack, Teague turned around and began barking orders at his crew. "Raise the mainsail! Set a northeasterly course!" Jack looked out to sea and sighed. He felt as if he had come so far, and now he was about to start over from scratch. So we find out why Fitzy was doing Teague's bidding earlier, and it was because of this ring that Teague has now given to Jack. But there is a tiny bit more, as this book does have an epilogue chapter. So we find Jack now on Isla Hermosa, and he's starting from scratch once again. He pays for a small boat with the money Teague gave him, and he sets off. Apparently, a woman in town had told him that a great treasure could be found on an island with a very tall peak nearby. So with this treasure in mind, Jack begins his next journey, and the book ends with this last passage. Did he want to live a pirate's life? Did he have a choice? Was it something that was just in his blood? Jack wasn't sure, but for the time being at least, he was planning on living the life for the moment. And maybe that was his answer. Maybe that made him pirate enough already. And that is the end of Sins of the Father. I hope you have all enjoyed this book and this episode. As I said, this is my absolute favorite book in this whole series, and now we are getting very close to finishing the series. We have 2 more books left in the series, and then we have one spin-off after that, and then it's over. So I really can't believe that this Young Jack Sparrow series has gone by so fast. I hope you've been enjoying these episodes, because I have had a lot of fun making them. But once we finish this series, we're going to go right into The Price of Freedom. So I hope you're ready for that, because I am super excited to cover The Price of Freedom. But anyway, next time we'll be covering the 11th book in the Young Jack Sparrow series, which is called Poseidon's Peak. And this one also contains the appearance of another major movie character, so stay tuned for that. Also, I'll mention my merch here one more time, and since we're getting close to the holiday season now, I do have some Christmas-themed Pirates of the Caribbean merch up in my store that you may recognize from the early 2000s if you had gone to the Disney parks back then when Pirates of the Caribbean was mega popular. You may remember the design of the Pirates logo with the candy canes instead of the swords, and it said "Yo ho ho ho." So I have a kind of a new version of that inspired by it, and I think it's really, really cool. So if you want to check it out, maybe purchase one for yourself or give it as a gift for someone this holiday season, the link to my merch store will be in the description of the episode. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode. You know that is really what means the most to me. If you really have bought merch, if you've rated or reviewed the podcast or messaged me, please know it really does mean so much to me. Make sure you come back for the coverage of Poseidon's Peak in the next episode. I will see you all then. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram and Threads at Podcast of the Caribbean, and over on Twitter/X at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content and trivia over there, so make sure to check those platforms out. You can also buy merchandise for this podcast over on TeePublic. Be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.